I've been driving trucks for over 20 years, and I thought I'd seen everything on these highways. But what happened to me last month on Nevada's Highway 50 still keeps me up at night, and I can't shake the feeling that something seriously messed up is going on out there. I'm posting this because I need to get it off my chest, and maybe someone else has experienced something similar. I was hauling a load of electronics from Reno to Denver when my usual route got shut down due to a massive pileup near Fallon. The dispatcher rerouted me onto Highway 50, which truckers call the loneliest road in America for good reason. I'd driven it maybe 3 times in my entire career, and each time it felt like driving through the middle of nowhere with nothing but sagebrush and mountains for company. The sun was already setting when I merged onto that godforsaken stretch of asphalt, and my CB was mostly quiet except for the occasional static burst. I remember thinking how I just wanted to get through Nevada and into Utah before midnight, but that plan went straight to hell real quick. The first weird thing happened around 9 p.m. when I heard another trucker's voice crackle through my CB radio. The guy sounded panicked, like genuinely shaken up, and he was talking about some woman named Rebecca who was stranded at milepost 346. He kept saying she was asking for help, that she looked scared and was waving her arms frantically near some kind of emergency phone or call box. Now, I've been down Highway 50 enough times to know the mileposts, and something about 346 didn't sit right with me. I grabbed my road atlas from the passenger seat and flipped to the Nevada section while keeping one eye on the road. Sure enough, Highway 50 through that stretch only goes up to around milepost 320 before hitting the Utah border. I figured it was just some rookie driver who got his numbers mixed up, or maybe some kids playing pranks on the CB frequency. You get that sometimes, especially on the lonely stretches where bored locals think it's funny to mess with truckers. I keyed my mic and asked the guy to repeat his location, but all I got back was static. The whole thing felt off, but I dismissed it and kept driving, cranking up my radio to stay alert. About 30 minutes later, I was coming up on this long, winding section through some canyon country when my CB crackled to life again. But this time, it wasn't the trucker's voice I heard. It was a woman's voice, and she sounded absolutely terrified. "Please, if anyone can hear this, I'm stranded at milepost 346 on Highway 50. My car broke down and there's something wrong here. I need help, please." The desperation in her voice made my skin crawl, and I could hear her breathing heavily like she'd been running or was really scared. What freaked me out even more was that she said the exact same words the other trucker had mentioned, word for word, like she was reading from a script. I immediately grabbed my CB and tried to respond, asking her to describe her surroundings or give me a landmark I could recognize. But just like with the trucker, all I got was dead air. The silence that followed felt heavy, like the kind of quiet you get right before a thunderstorm hits. I kept driving, but my hands were gripping the steering wheel tighter now, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. I should have just kept driving straight through to Utah, but curiosity got the better of me. Against every instinct screaming in my head, I started looking for anything that might be around where milepost 346 would theoretically be located. The road curved through this rocky canyon area, and I spotted what looked like an old, run-down motel tucked back against the canyon wall. There was a flickering neon sign that I could barely make out, and a few vehicles parked in the lot that looked like they'd been there for years. Something about the whole setup felt wrong, like really wrong. The building looked abandoned, but there were lights on in a couple of rooms, and I could see shadows moving behind the curtains. I pulled my rig over to the shoulder about a quarter mile past the motel and grabbed my flashlight and tire iron. Looking back, I realize how stupid that was, but at the time, I kept thinking about that woman's voice and how genuinely terrified she sounded. I figured if someone really needed help, I couldn't just drive by and ignore it. I walked back toward the motel, staying in the shadows along the roadside, and that's when I noticed there were actually several people moving around the property. These weren't tourists or stranded travelers. These guys looked rough, like the kind of people you'd cross the street to avoid in broad daylight. I counted at least 4 of them, and they were all wearing dark clothing and seemed to be carrying something, though I couldn't make out what from my distance. One of them kept walking between the motel rooms and an old pickup truck, like he was loading or unloading stuff. The whole scene had this tense, secretive vibe that made every alarm bell in my head go off at once. I crouched down behind some rocks and tried to get a better look, but the flickering neon sign kept casting weird shadows that made it hard to see clearly. That's when I heard voices, not the woman calling for help, but men talking in low, urgent tones. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was definitely not friendly conversation. My gut told me to get the hell out of there immediately, but I was still thinking about Rebecca and whether she might actually be in trouble somewhere nearby. I was about to head back to my truck when I heard my CB radio crackling from inside the cab. Even from where I was crouched, I could hear that same woman's voice coming through the speaker. "Please, if anyone can hear this, I'm stranded at milepost 346 on Highway 50. My car broke down and there's something wrong here. I need help, please." It was identical to what I'd heard before. Same tone, same pauses, same desperate breathing. But here's the thing that made my blood run cold. While I was listening to this transmission, I was watching those men at the motel, and none of them were near any kind of radio equipment. The timing was too perfect, too coincidental. That's when it hit me that this whole situation was some kind of setup, and I was probably walking into something dangerous. I didn't know if those guys were connected to the radio calls somehow, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I started backing away from the motel, keeping low and moving as quietly as possible, but my boots kept crunching on the gravel, and I was sure they were going to hear me. The last thing I saw before I made it back to my truck was one of the men looking in my direction, like he'd spotted movement in the darkness. I got back to my rig and fired it up as quietly as I could, but a diesel engine starting up in the middle of nowhere isn't exactly subtle. I pulled back onto Highway 50 and drove for about 10 miles before I felt safe enough to stop and think about what I'd just witnessed. My hands were still shaking when I grabbed my CB to report what I'd seen, but I honestly didn't know what to tell anyone. How do you explain that you heard a distress call from a non-existent milepost and found a bunch of sketchy guys at an abandoned motel? I tried calling the Nevada Highway Patrol on my cell, but the signal was too weak to get through. The whole thing felt surreal, like I'd stumbled into some kind of trap or scam, but I couldn't figure out what the angle was. Were they trying to lure truckers off the road to rob them? Was it human trafficking? My mind was racing with possibilities, none of them good. I kept driving east, checking my mirrors constantly to make sure nobody was following me, and I didn't stop again until I reached a truck stop in Utah around 2 a.m. The next morning, I called the Nevada State Police from the truck stop and tried to report what I'd experienced. The dispatcher was professional but clearly skeptical when I mentioned the milepost 346 detail and the mysterious motel. She took down my information and said they'd look into it, but I could tell from her tone that she thought I was either confused about the location or making the whole thing up. I also asked if there were any missing person reports for a woman named Rebecca, specifically someone with the last name that sounded like what I thought I'd heard on the radio. After being transferred around for 20 minutes, they told me there was no record of any Rebecca Scheller, Rebecca Seller, or any similar name reported missing in Nevada in the past month. That information should have made me feel better, like maybe it really was just some elaborate prank, but instead it made everything feel more unsettling. If Rebecca wasn't real, then who was that voice on the radio? And what were those men doing at that motel in the middle of nowhere? I finished my delivery run to Denver, but the whole experience kept nagging at me like a splinter I couldn't dig out. The really disturbing part started about a week later when I was on another run through Arizona. I was listening to my CB around the same time of night, just monitoring the chatter to stay alert when I heard her voice again. Same woman, same desperate tone, same exact words. "Please, if anyone can hear this, I'm stranded at milepost 346 on Highway 50. My car broke down and there's something wrong here. I need help, please." I nearly swerved off the road when I heard it because I was nowhere near Nevada. I was on I-40 heading toward Flagstaff. I grabbed the mic and started asking other drivers if they were hearing the same transmission, but nobody else seemed to pick it up. One guy told me my radio might be malfunctioning and picking up old signals somehow, but that didn't explain why I was the only one hearing it. The transmission lasted maybe 30 seconds, then cut off into static just like before. I pulled over at the next rest area and checked all my CB equipment, but everything looked normal. I even tried switching channels, but the voice didn't come back that night. Over the next few weeks, I heard Rebecca's call 3 more times on different routes in different states. Each time it was exactly the same message, like a recording playing on loop, and each time I was the only driver who seemed to hear it. But the last time I heard it, something else happened that made my blood freeze. Right after Rebecca's voice cut out, there was a different voice, a man's voice, low and gravelly, and he said just 2 words, "Got another." The way he said it was casual, almost satisfied, like he was checking something off a list. I immediately tried to respond, asking who was there and what they meant, but again, nothing but static. That night I barely slept, and I started researching everything I could find about Highway 50. Missing persons in Nevada. and anything related to milepost 346. I found a few old forum posts from other truckers mentioning weird CB transmissions in that area, but nothing concrete enough to make sense of what I'd experienced. The whole thing felt like I'd stumbled into something bigger and more dangerous than just a simple prank. I started avoiding Highway 50 completely after that, taking longer routes that added hours to my trips just to stay away from that stretch of Nevada desert. But the voices followed me anyway. Rebecca's call came through my CB at least once a month, always at night, always when I was alone on some empty highway. And that man's voice, got another, started showing up more frequently too, sometimes right after Rebecca, sometimes on its own. I began keeping a log of when and where I heard these transmissions, thinking maybe I could find a pattern or figure out what was really going on. The dates and locations were completely random: Texas, Montana, Colorado, New Mexico, but the messages never changed. It was like someone or something was using my CB radio as their personal communication device, and I was just an unwilling listener. I talked to other veteran drivers about it, but most of them looked at me like I was losing my mind. A few guys mentioned hearing weird stuff on their radios over the years, but nothing as specific or consistent as what I was experiencing. The worst part is that I started recognizing something in that man's voice, a kind of cold satisfaction that made me think he wasn't just playing pranks. There was something predatory about the way he said "got another," like he was collecting something or someone. I couldn't shake the feeling that Rebecca's distress call wasn't just a recording, but maybe a real cry for help that had been captured somehow and was being replayed over and over. Maybe she was the first "another" he got, and now her voice was being used to lure other people into whatever trap I'd almost walked into at that motel. I started carrying a gun in my cab after that, something I'd never felt the need to do in 20 years of trucking. Every time I heard those voices, I'd check my mirrors more carefully and make sure my doors were locked. I know how paranoid this all sounds, but when you're driving alone through the middle of nowhere at 2 a.m. and you hear the same terrified woman begging for help month after month, it does something to your head. The last time I heard from Rebecca was about 2 months ago, and it was different somehow. Her voice sounded more distant, like the signal was weaker or coming from farther away. But what really got to me was that she said something new at the end. Just 3 words that weren't part of her usual script. Don't trust them. The way she said it was urgent, like she was trying to warn someone. And then the transmission cut out completely. I waited for the man's voice to follow, but there was only silence. I haven't heard either voice since that night, and honestly, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Part of me wonders if Rebecca finally escaped whatever situation she was in, or if something worse happened that ended the transmissions permanently. I've driven past that section of Highway 50 twice since then, during daylight hours with other traffic around, and the motel is still there, but it looks completely abandoned now. No vehicles, no lights, no signs of life at all. I've told this story to my dispatcher, to other drivers, even to my wife, but nobody really believes the whole thing. They think the isolation and long hours on the road are getting to me, that I'm hearing things or mixing up dreams with reality. Maybe they're right, but I know what I heard. And I know what I saw that night at the motel. Something was happening out there in the middle of nowhere. Something that involved luring people off the highway with fake distress calls. I don't know if it was human trafficking, robbery, or something even worse, but I'm convinced that motel was some kind of trap. The fact that there's no record of Rebecca Scheller being reported missing doesn't prove she wasn't real. It might just mean nobody knew she was gone, or nobody cared enough to report it. These days, I stick to the major interstates and avoid the lonely highways as much as possible. But sometimes, late at night when I'm driving through empty country, I still turn my CB to that same frequency and listen for her voice. Not because I want to hear it, but because I feel like someone should be listening, just in case she's still out there somewhere, still calling for help. I'm still shaking as I write this, and it's been 3 weeks since that night. I don't care if people think I'm crazy. I need to get this story out there because other drivers need to know about Cab 17. I've been trucking for 15 years, and I thought I'd seen everything on the road, but nothing prepared me for what happened that night in that cursed rig. I was running a load from Phoenix to Denver, and the company had assigned me to this older Peterbilt that I'd never driven before. The dispatcher said it was Cab 17, and when I picked it up from the yard, something felt off about it right away. The interior was too clean, like someone had scrubbed it down with bleach, and there was this weird smell I couldn't identify. Not diesel fumes or air freshener, but something stale and cold. The previous driver's personal items were still scattered around the cab, which struck me as strange since drivers usually clean out their stuff when they switch rigs. I found a coffee mug with the name Mike written on it, some unopened mail, and a phone charger still plugged into the cigarette lighter. I should have listened to my gut and requested a different truck, but I had a tight delivery schedule and didn't want to cause problems with dispatch. The first day of driving went normally enough, though I noticed the CB radio kept picking up strange static bursts, even when I wasn't on any active channels. I made it to a truck stop outside Flagstaff around 10 p.m. and decided to get some sleep in the sleeper berth before pushing on to Denver in the morning. That's when things started getting really weird. I woke up at exactly 3:17 a.m. I remember the time clearly because the digital clock was the only thing glowing in the pitch-black cab. Everything was completely dead. No dashboard lights, no engine block heater running, no idle rumble from the engine. The silence was so complete it felt unnatural, like someone had wrapped the entire truck in soundproof material. I tried to start the engine but got nothing. The battery was completely drained, which made no sense since I'd shut everything down properly before going to sleep. I grabbed my flashlight to check under the hood, but when I climbed out of the sleeper berth, I froze when I saw the passenger door. There were 3 deep scratches running vertically down the passenger door, like someone had dragged their fingernails or claws across the metal. These weren't small surface scratches. They were gouged deep enough that I could feel them with my finger, and they definitely hadn't been there when I parked the night before. I know this because I always do a walk-around inspection of any rig I'm driving, especially one I'm not familiar with. The scratches looked fresh too, with tiny metal shavings still clinging to the edges like they'd just been made. What really freaked me out was how deliberate they looked. 3 parallel lines, perfectly spaced, starting about shoulder height and running down to the door handle. I stood there in the parking lot at 3 a.m., shining my flashlight on those scratches and trying to figure out what could have made them. There were no trees nearby that could have scraped the truck, no other vehicles parked close enough to cause damage, and the truck stop was well lit with security cameras. I walked around the entire rig looking for any other damage, but the scratches were only on that one door. I was about to head inside the truck stop to report the vandalism when my CB radio suddenly crackled to life, which was impossible since the battery was completely dead. The sound made me jump because everything else in the cab was still dark and silent. What I heard next made my blood turn to ice water. It was my own voice coming through the speaker, having a conversation I didn't remember having. I was talking to someone about my route, mentioning that I was driving cab 17 and planning to stop in Flagstaff for the night, but I couldn't remember talking to anyone on the CB during my drive, and I definitely hadn't mentioned the cab number to anyone. The recording of my voice sounded normal at first, just regular trucker chatter, but then I heard something that made me want to run screaming from that parking lot. After my voice stopped, there was a pause, then a whisper, not through the CB static, but clear as if someone was sitting right next to me in the cab. The voice was soft, almost childlike, but there was something wrong with it, something that made every hair on my body stand up. It said, "Let me in. I'm cold." The way it drew out the word cold made it sound like whoever was speaking hadn't been warm in a very long time. I grabbed my keys and my wallet and got the hell out of that truck as fast as I could. I didn't care about my clothes or my logbook or anything else. I just needed to get away from cab 17 right then. I practically ran across the parking lot to the truck stop, looking over my shoulder the whole time like something was chasing me. Inside, I found another driver named Hank who was sitting at the counter drinking coffee and working on his logbook. He took one look at my face and asked if I was okay, because apparently I looked like I'd seen a ghost. I told him about the dead battery and asked if he could give me a jump start, but I didn't mention the scratches or the voices. I was still trying to convince myself that maybe I'd been dreaming or something. Hank was a good guy, probably in his 60s with gray hair and the kind of weathered face you get from decades on the road. He agreed to help me out, and we walked back to the trucks together. When he saw cab 17, though, his whole demeanor changed. He stopped walking and just stared at the truck for a long moment, then looked at me with this expression I couldn't read. "You're driving 17?" he asked, and there was something in his voice that made me nervous. When I nodded, he shook his head slowly and muttered something under his breath that I couldn't catch. We got his truck positioned for the jump start, and while we were hooking up the cables, Hank kept glancing at cab 17, like it might suddenly come to life and attack us. Finally, I asked him what was wrong, and that's when he told me the story that's been keeping me awake every night since. According to Hank, Cab 17 had a reputation among drivers who'd been around long enough to remember. The truck had been through 17 different drivers in the past 5 years, and not one of them had quit normally or transferred to another rig. They'd all just disappeared, some during runs, some from truck stops, some from their own homes. The company kept assigning new drivers to the truck, but nobody ever lasted more than a few months. Hank said the original owner of the rig, a driver named Mike Thompson, had vanished from a rest area in New Mexico about 6 years ago. They found his truck running with the door open and his wallet and keys still inside, but Mike was never seen again. The truck sat in impound for months before the company bought it at auction and put it back in service. That's when Hank told me about the pattern, and every word he said made my stomach drop further. He said every driver who'd been assigned to Cab 17 reported the same things before they disappeared: dead battery in the middle of the night, 3 scratches on the passenger door, and voices coming through the CB radio when the electrical system was supposed to be completely dead. Some drivers lasted longer than others, but they all eventually vanished without a trace. The company never officially acknowledged the pattern, just kept rotating new drivers into the truck whenever the previous one went missing. Hank said there was a theory among the old-timers that Cab 17 was cursed, that it somehow collected a soul from every driver who spent time in it. The number 17 wasn't just the cab number. It represented how many drivers had gone missing while assigned to that truck. He told me about a driver named Carlos who'd lasted almost 3 months before disappearing from a truck stop in Oklahoma, and another guy named Jim who'd made it 6 weeks before vanishing from his own driveway. Each time, the company would clean out the truck, assign it to someone new, and the cycle would start over again. While Hank was talking, we got my engine started, but I couldn't stop staring at those scratches on the passenger door. In the light from his headlights, they looked even deeper and more deliberate than before. Hank noticed me looking and walked over to examine them himself. He ran his finger along the grooves and nodded grimly, like he'd seen the same thing before. "Those always show up first," he said quietly. "Then comes the dead battery, then the voices. After that, you've got maybe a week or 2 before." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. I asked him why he'd never reported this to the authorities or tried to get the truck taken out of service. He laughed bitterly and said he'd tried talking to dispatchers, safety managers, even state police over the years, but nobody wanted to hear about a cursed truck. The company had too much money invested in the rig to scrap it based on what they called driver superstitions, and the cops couldn't investigate disappearances that happened across multiple states and jurisdictions. As far as the official records were concerned, those 17 drivers had all quit their jobs and moved on with their lives, even though their families and friends knew better. I spent the rest of that night in the truck stop restaurant, drinking coffee and trying to process everything Hank had told me. When morning came, I called my dispatcher and told him I needed to switch trucks immediately, citing mechanical problems with Cab 17. He wasn't happy about the inconvenience, but he agreed to have me drop the load at the Denver terminal and pick up a different rig for my return trip. I drove that cursed truck for the last time on the way to Denver, keeping my CB radio turned off and stopping only for fuel. Every mile felt like I was tempting fate, and I kept checking my mirrors, expecting to see something following me. The scratches on the passenger door seemed to get deeper as the day went on, and I swear I could feel something watching me from the sleeper berth, even though I knew it was empty. When I finally delivered the load and handed over the keys to Cab 17, I felt like a huge weight had been lifted off my shoulders. The yard supervisor who took the keys was a guy I'd known for years, and I tried to warn him about the truck's history, but he just rolled his eyes and said I'd been spending too much time on the road. A few weeks later, I heard through the grapevine that the new driver assigned to Cab 17 was a young guy fresh out of trucking school, eager to prove himself on long hauls. I tried to track him down to warn him, but the company wouldn't give me his contact information, citing privacy policies. I did some digging on my own and found out that the truck had been in the shop for electrical problems right after I'd turned it in. The mechanic had discovered that someone had deliberately tampered with the wiring, creating a slow drain that would kill the battery after a few hours. But here's the thing that still gives me chills. The sabotage was done from inside the cab, in places that would have been impossible to reach without completely dismantling the dashboard. The mechanic said it looked like the work had been done over a long period of time, with tiny modifications made to different systems that would eventually cause a complete electrical failure. Whoever had done it knew exactly how to make the truck vulnerable, like they'd been planning it for months or even years. The company fixed the wiring issues and put Cab 17 back in service, but I kept hearing rumors about problems with the new driver. According to other truckers I talked to, the kid had been calling dispatch almost daily with complaints about strange noises, electrical problems, and equipment malfunctions that the mechanics couldn't replicate when they inspected the truck. He'd also been posting on social media about weird experiences on the road, photos of his CB radio displaying channels that didn't exist, recordings of voices speaking languages he didn't recognize, and pictures of mysterious scratches appearing on his truck overnight. Most people dismissed his posts as attention-seeking behavior from a rookie driver, but I recognized the pattern Hank had described. The kid lasted exactly 6 weeks before he stopped answering his phone and missed a scheduled delivery in Kansas City. They found Cab 17 parked at a rest area with the engine running and the driver's door wide open, just like all the others. His personal belongings were still in the sleeper berth, his wallet was on the passenger seat, and there was no sign of struggle or foul play. The police investigated for about a week before closing the case as a voluntary disappearance, and the company quietly reassigned the truck to their next victim. I haven't driven Cab 17 since that night in Flagstaff, but I still hear about it through the trucking community grapevine. The truck is still in service, still getting assigned to unsuspecting drivers who don't know its history, and the disappearances continue like clockwork. I've tried reaching out to families of some of the missing drivers, but most of them don't want to hear theories about cursed trucks. They just want their loved ones found. The company has gotten better at covering up the pattern, spreading the assignments across different terminals and regions so that no single dispatcher sees the full picture. But the truck keeps claiming its victims, one every few months, always following the same terrifying routine. Sometimes I wonder if I should have stayed in Cab 17 that night, if running away just condemned some other poor driver to take my place. But then I remember that whisper in the darkness. Let me in, I'm cold, and I know I made the right choice. Whatever is attached to that truck, whatever force is collecting souls from drivers, it's still out there hunting. And until someone finds a way to stop it permanently, Cab 17 will keep rolling down America's highways, looking for its next victim. I've been hauling logs through these mountains for 12 years, and I thought I knew every trick for handling heavy loads in bad weather. But what happened to me last February on Bear Creek Pass still makes my hands shake when I think about it. And I'm not talking about just the near-death experience with my truck. I'm talking about who saved my life that night, and what I found out about her later. I was running behind schedule on a load of old-growth timber from the Harrison Creek site down to the mill in Spokane, and the weather forecast was calling for heavy snow starting around midnight. My dispatcher, Tom, told me to find a place to park and wait it out, but I figured I could beat the worst of it if I pushed through Bear Creek Pass before the storm really hit. That was my first mistake, thinking I could outsmart Mother Nature with a fully loaded logging truck carrying 40 tons of timber. The old-timers at the camp had always warned us about that pass in winter, saying it had claimed more truckers than any other stretch of mountain road in the state. I started the climb up Bear Creek Pass around 11 p.m., and the snow was already coming down harder than the forecast had predicted. The flakes were big and wet, sticking to my windshield faster than the wipers could clear them, and the temperature was dropping fast enough that I could see ice starting to form on the guardrails. My load was strapped down tight with 4 chains and 8 binders, the same way I'd done it hundreds of times before. But something felt different about the way the trailer was handling on the curves. The logs were prime Douglas fir, some of them over 3 feet in diameter, and they'd been loaded in a hurry at the end of a long day. I should have stopped and rechecked my securement, but I was so focused on beating the storm that I ignored the warning signs. About halfway up the pass, I felt the trailer start to sway slightly on a tight left curve, but I convinced myself it was just the wind and kept climbing. The snow was getting so thick that my headlights were only illuminating about 20 feet ahead, and I had to slow down to maybe 15 miles per hour just to stay on the road. When I reached the summit turnout, that's when everything went to hell. I was making the sharp right turn at the top of the pass when I felt the whole trailer shift violently to the left, like someone had grabbed it and yanked it sideways. The load had broken loose from its chains, and I could hear the logs sliding and crashing against each other in the trailer bed. I tried to straighten out and get control, but 40 tons of timber doesn't care what you want it to do. It goes where physics tells it to go. The trailer kept sliding toward the guardrail, and I knew if those logs went over the side, they'd take me in the cab with them. I managed to get the truck stopped in the turnout, but when I climbed out to assess the damage, my heart just sank. Half my load had avalanched off the trailer and was scattered across the turnout and down the embankment. Logs were everywhere, some of them weighing over 2 tons each, and my trailer was tilted at an angle that made it clear I wasn't going anywhere without major help. The snow was coming down so hard now that I could barely see 10 feet in any direction, and the wind was howling through the trees like something out of a horror movie. I tried calling dispatch on my radio, but all I got was static. The storm was interfering with everything electronic. My cell phone showed no signal, which wasn't surprising since we were in a dead zone anyway. I was completely stranded at the top of a mountain pass in a blizzard, with no way to call for help and no way to move my truck. The temperature was dropping fast, and I could feel the cold seeping through my jacket, even though I was bundled up for winter driving. I knew I had maybe 6 or 7 hours before hypothermia became a real problem, and there was no guarantee the storm would let up by morning. I was trying to figure out if I should stay with the truck or try to walk down the mountain when I saw headlights cutting through the snow behind me. At first I thought I was hallucinating from the stress and cold, but then I heard the distinct sound of another diesel engine approaching. A logging truck came around the curve and pulled into the turnout behind me, and I've never been so happy to see another vehicle in my entire life. The driver climbed out and walked toward me, and that's when I got my first look at Sarah Larson. She was a woman in her 30s, maybe 5'6", with short brown hair sticking out from under a knit cap, and the kind of confident walk you only see from someone who's been working in the woods for years. What struck me most was how calm she seemed despite the conditions, like driving through a blizzard at midnight to help a stranded trucker was just another day at the office for her. She was wearing standard logger gear, heavy boots, and a thick jacket with reflective stripes, and she had a toolbox in one hand and a heavy-duty flashlight in the other. When she got close enough to talk over the wind, she introduced herself as Sarah and said she'd been sent to help me secure my load and get back down the mountain safely. I was so relieved to see another human being that I didn't even question how she'd known I was in trouble or who had sent her. All I cared about was that someone with logging experience was there to help me figure out how to get out of this mess alive. She took one look at my scattered load and the tilted trailer and nodded like she'd seen the same situation a dozen times before. Sarah knew exactly what she was doing, and she worked with the kind of efficiency that only comes from years of experience handling heavy timber in dangerous conditions. She had me position my truck to use the winch system while she climbed around on the scattered logs, attaching cables and rigging them for recovery. The wind was so strong it nearly knocked me over a few times, but she moved around like the storm wasn't even affecting her. We worked for what felt like hours, using a combination of my truck's winch, some come-alongs she had in her toolbox, and good old-fashioned leverage to get the logs back onto my trailer. She knew tricks for load securement that I'd never seen before, ways to tie down timber that would hold even in the worst conditions. While we worked, she told me she'd been logging these mountains for over a decade and had seen plenty of drivers get into trouble on Bear Creek Pass. She said the key was respecting the mountain and never taking shortcuts when weather was involved. Advice that hit home since taking a shortcut was exactly what had gotten me into this situation. By the time we finished, my load was more secure than it had been when I'd left the camp that afternoon. The descent down Bear Creek Pass was terrifying even with Sarah leading the way in her truck. She kept her flashers on and maintained a steady pace that was slow enough to be safe but fast enough to keep momentum on the icy sections. I followed her taillights through the swirling snow, and several times I lost sight of her completely when the wind would whip the snow across the road in white sheets. She seemed to know exactly where every curve and steep section was, navigating the treacherous road like she'd driven it 1,000 times in conditions just like this. About halfway down, we hit a section where the road was covered in black ice, and my trailer started to slide toward the guardrail again. I thought for sure I was going to lose control and end up in the ravine. But Sarah somehow anticipated it and positioned her truck to block the slide, giving me something solid to straighten out against. When we finally reached the bottom of the pass and pulled into the staging area at Bear Creek Camp, I was shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. I climbed out of my cab expecting to thank Sarah properly and maybe buy her breakfast, but when I looked around, her truck was nowhere to be seen. I walked over to the camp office to check in and let them know I'd made it down safely. And that's when things started getting really strange. The night supervisor, a guy named Pete who I'd known for years, asked me how I'd managed to get my load secured and make it down the pass in that storm. When I told him about Sarah Larson helping me out, his face went completely white and he just stared at me for a long moment. He asked me to describe her again, and when I did, he walked over to a filing cabinet and pulled out a folder. Inside was a driver's license photo of the exact woman who had saved my life that night. Same face, same short brown hair, same confident expression. But according to the paperwork in that folder, Sarah Larson had died 5 years earlier in a logging accident on Bear Creek Pass. Pete told me she'd been hauling a load of timber down the mountain during a winter storm when her truck went through the guardrail at the same turnout where I'd gotten stranded. They'd found her truck at the bottom of the ravine 3 days later, but her body was never recovered due to the difficult terrain and continued bad weather. Pete pulled out more paperwork and showed me the accident report from 5 years ago. Sarah had been driving for the same logging company I worked for, and she'd been considered one of the best drivers they had, someone who knew the mountain roads better than anyone and never took unnecessary risks. The accident happened during a storm similar to the one I'd just been through, but according to witnesses who found the wreckage, it looked like she'd tried to help another stranded driver and lost control of her own truck in the process. The other driver, a guy named Mike Holloway, had also died when his load shifted and sent him over the guardrail. Pete said it was the worst logging accident the company had ever experienced, and they'd changed their policies about winter driving because of it. Sarah's truck was totaled beyond recognition, crushed under tons of timber at the bottom of a 200-foot drop, but they'd never been able to explain exactly what had caused her to lose control. The investigation concluded that she'd probably tried to use her truck to help stabilize the other driver's load, just like she'd done for me. But the conditions were too dangerous and both vehicles went over the edge. I stood there in that office, holding Sarah's personnel file and trying to make sense of what I'd experienced. The woman in the photo was definitely the same person who had worked beside me for hours in that blizzard, but according to every official record, she'd been dead for 5 years. Pete could see how shaken up I was, and he told me that other drivers had reported seeing Sarah on Bear Creek Pass over the years, always during bad weather, and always when someone was in serious trouble. Most people dismiss these sightings as stress-induced hallucinations or cases of mistaken identity, but Pete had heard the stories often enough to wonder if there might be something to them. He said the old-timers believed that people who died trying to help others sometimes couldn't rest until they'd finished what they started. Sarah had died helping a fellow driver, and maybe she was still up there on that mountain, making sure other people didn't suffer the same fate. It sounded crazy when he said it, but I couldn't argue with what I'd experienced firsthand. The next morning, I drove back up to the summit turnout in daylight to see if I could find any trace of Sarah or her truck. The storm had passed, leaving everything covered in fresh snow, but I could clearly see the tire tracks from where we'd worked the night before. There were 2 sets of tracks in the turnout, mine and another set that matched the size and pattern of a logging truck. But here's what made my blood run cold. Those second tracks just stopped at the edge of the turnout, like the truck had simply vanished into thin air. I followed them to where they ended, and there was no sign that another vehicle had turned around or backed out. The tracks led right to the guardrail and then disappeared, as if the truck had driven straight through the metal barrier without disturbing it. I spent an hour searching the area, looking for any physical evidence that Sarah had been there. Tire marks on the road surface, footprints in the snow, anything that would prove I hadn't imagined the whole thing. All I found were the cable marks on some of the logs where we'd rigged them for recovery, and those could have been explained away as evidence of my own work. That afternoon, I called the company's Human Resources Department and asked them to pull Sarah Larson's employment records. The woman on the phone was hesitant at first, citing privacy policies, but when I explained that I'd worked with Sarah the night before, she agreed to check the files. After a few minutes on hold, she came back with information that confirmed everything Pete had told me. Sarah Larson had been employed as a logging truck driver from 2016 until her death in February 2019, exactly 5 years before my encounter with her. She'd been an exemplary employee with a perfect safety record, known for helping other drivers and never refusing a difficult assignment. The HR representative also mentioned something that Pete hadn't told me. Sarah had volunteered for winter storm duty, specifically requesting to be on call for emergencies on Bear Creek Pass because she knew the road so well. She'd saved 3 drivers from serious accidents during her time with the company before the storm that claimed her own life. When I asked if there were any other employees named Sarah Larson or anyone who might be using her identity, the HR representative assured me that was impossible. The company had strict policies about background checks and identification verification. I kept thinking about that night for weeks afterward, trying to find some logical explanation for what had happened. I researched everything I could about Bear Creek Pass, looking for stories of other supernatural encounters or unexplained rescues. What I found were dozens of accounts from drivers who claimed to have been helped by mysterious Good Samaritans during winter emergencies, people who appeared out of nowhere and then vanished without a trace. Some of the descriptions matched Sarah perfectly. A calm, competent woman who knew exactly how to handle logging equipment in dangerous road conditions. But every time someone tried to track down these helpful strangers afterward, they hit the same dead end I had. No record of dispatch sending help, no other drivers in the area at the time, and no logical explanation for how someone could appear and disappear so completely. The more I researched, the more convinced I became that Sarah Larson wasn't the only ghost helping stranded travelers on that mountain. Bear Creek Pass had claimed so many lives over the years that maybe some of those spirits couldn't move on, especially the ones who died trying to help others. About a month after my encounter, I was having coffee at the truck stop in Spokane when I overheard two drivers talking about a recent rescue on Bear Creek Pass. A rookie logger had gotten his load shifted during a snowstorm and been helped by a woman who appeared out of nowhere, worked with him for hours to get his truck roadworthy, then disappeared before he could properly thank her. The description matched Sarah exactly, right down to the confident way she moved and her expertise with load securement. When I approached the drivers and asked for more details, they looked at me like I was crazy for being so interested in what they considered just another case of professional courtesy among truckers. But I knew better. Sarah was still up there on that mountain, still helping drivers who found themselves in the same desperate situation she'd died trying to resolve. The thought should have been comforting, knowing that someone was watching out for us on that dangerous stretch of road. But instead, it filled me with a deep sadness. She'd been such a good person in life that even death couldn't stop her from helping others. But that also meant she was trapped up there, reliving the same rescue scenario over and over again, never able to rest.